Is anything still sacred? Today, we look at the impact a Danish news cartoon has had on the Muslim community. Welcome to Listen Up. I'm Lorna Dueck. Today, the dangerous work of protecting religious symbols from the world of free speech. Images of the holy and what to do when sacred is offended by secular. What began as one newspaper's experiment has turned into a political fever of frightening proportions. Deaths, rioting, protests that have taken place in many Middle Eastern countries and rocked the world. All fueled by international Muslim outrage over 12 Danish cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad.
Freedom of speech is one thing, but you have to be responsible with freedom of speech, just like anything else. And if it's just to tick people off, then I think that you need to you have the responsibility to not do that. And I think that the cartoonists are somewhat to blame. I think the main blame goes to the Danish editor who commissioned the cartoonists to do these depictions of Muhammad.
Listen Up spoke with Canadian Muslim leaders over the crisis. Tariq Fatah could be described as a secular Muslim who believes in complete separation of state and religion and faces criticism because of his views. He's a Muslim broadcaster and director of the Muslim Canadian Congress. Hussein Handami is a lawyer. He describes himself as a traditional Shiite Muslim, and he leads a growing revival movement of Islam in Canada.
Well, I was deeply concerned because I felt that this was one step of many steps in trying to incite a response from the Muslim community, trying to demonize the community. Worst of all, trying to demonize the Prophet of God. And for Muslims, the Prophet Muhammad is like our path, our greatest teacher to the divine. And there couldn't be any more person or personality that you could offend, that you could depict that would offend the Muslims more.
Okay, but the path that this has taken is, I'm sure, even to you as a moderate and certainly to me as an observer, it is alarming where your path has taken these people.
Well, where is the path? I would say that there's 1.3 billion Muslims around the world. 99.6% of them are protesting peacefully, are writing letters, or doing nothing.
Even the atheists in the Muslim community look up to the Prophet as the epitome of a man of courage, compassion, reason, humor, moral character, good eating habits, good cleanliness, a man of immense integrity. Literally, if I became the devil's advocate and tried to find a flaw, I couldn't find a flaw in that man. And so this is like ripping my parents naked in the middle of town square and then celebrating it as a freedom of press. So that was my anger at this, but my fear was provoked and we'll get provoked.
Is there going to be any way that this kind of fruit can be changed in your faith when provoked?
Well, I think Tariq raises a good point, which is some of these governments are doing this in an attempt for wholly domestic reasons. They're trying to show their people, the masses, we are the defenders of Islam in this part of the world.
So this is political points in their own backyard.
Yeah, I mean,
this has nothing to do.
No, there are genuinely people on the street,
of course,
who are upset and who are overreacting and who are doing things that are problematic. Granted, but I'm saying people need to look at this in the context that it's in. That there is domestic reasons for why Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, etc., are encouraging their population to do this.
The arrogance of the European media will have to dilute itself. They will come to a sort of a consensus that using freedom of press, you can't depict Jews and African the way they used to do in the 19th and 20th century, and the 21st century, you cannot do that to the Muslims. That recognition will come. Number two, Muslims will also realize that they have they now have to respond to the challenge that extremists can manipulate their faith and use it to their own advantage. So these two things will come around. I am quite optimistic.
I'm optimistic as well. I think it will peter out. However, here's my proviso. I think the extremists within the Muslim community and extremists within the non-Muslim community need to understand that there are certain things that are sacred in this world.
Well, point proven.
And people need to not usurp sacred symbols of other people's, whether it's the symbol of Jesus within the Christian community and the Muslim community, or the Star of David within the Jewish community, or the Prophet Muhammad or the Quran within the Muslim community. Certain things are sacred, and when you provoke and you demonize or denigrate those symbols, there will be a backlash. Sacredness needs to be defended.
For years, the Muslims have been saying, don't judge us by the actions of one criminal by the name of Osama bin Laden. Now we are saying, judge all Danish people for the acts of one cartoonist. It's a dangerous road to go. You cannot have collective punishment in democratic civic societies. The way to protest over here is to boycott that newspaper, boycott the newspapers that associate with that, and then write to them and pass legislation in Denmark. There are Muslim members of parliament there. Work with them, with other peace groups, and say that we need legislation against hate, just the way it is in Canada.
For an observer's perspective on the controversy, we're joined by someone who was a devout Shiite Muslim, Reza Safa. He has written extensively about his faith journey, and to help us understand the furor that was unleashed, he joins us from his new home in Tulsa, Oklahoma. What is your advice to a Muslim person who says, I just did not expect this kind of anger and wrath could come out of my faith?
You know, you have to recognize that the majority of the Muslims do not really know the teaching of the Quran. And majority of the Muslims do not read. You have to understand only 20% of all Muslims can read the Quran because you have to read it in Arabic. And 80% of all Muslims out of 1.3 billion people do not speak Arabic. So therefore, the teaching of the Islamic faith mainly is fables that has been handed down to people.
I can read the Quran in English.
Well, they say it's not accepted. You have to read it according to the Islamic faith. That's why we Persians speak Farsi, but I had to learn the Arabic language. I had to go when I was a child to school to learn it in order for me to read the Quran. The majority of the people in Iran are turning away from Islam once they have tasted the reality of it. Up to that point, up to the point of the Islamic Revolution, Islam was a fable, was a historical event. We just believed Islam was the highest rank of religions. But once we saw the reality of the chopping hands, chopping heads, and hanging the drug addicts in the streets, and the way they treated the woman, so once the Islamic Shariat was put in place, then people don't want it. And this is what it is right now. It's a really clash of civilization, of democracy and the faith of Islam. The 20th century Muslim cannot live that lifestyle of the 7th century, and this is what we are seeing. It's taking place right now. What
was the cost for you to say, I cannot live that lifestyle?
Well, of course, my family disowned me. My father said to me, he said, I accepted the Lord. It was in Sweden, 1980. My father called me. He said, if you were here, I would have killed you myself. And my mother tried to send me to a mental hospital through the embassy, Iranian embassy in Stockholm. And so, you know, for many years I had no contact with them whatsoever. And still, you know, to my sisters, still I'm unclean. And so when my sister, after 4 years, decided to come and see me, every time she touched me, she had to wash her hand and wash her face. And but of course now it has changed. They've seen the reality of the life of Jesus in me, and my mother accepted the Lord. One of my sisters accepted the Lord. But it was, you know, for the first 3-4 years of my faith, it was hell on the earth for me.
Thank you, Reza, very much for your insights into the current controversy.
My pleasure.
When we come back, we look at symbols from the current Rolling Stones cover to the Oscars look at Jesus through the imagery of a lion. Sacred symbols and how they impact us when we come back. Well, welcome back. Here to help us understand holy images and their purpose and protection, John Franklin, director of Imago, which promotes art done by Christians, sacred art, and Professor James Beverly of Tyndale University, author of various books on Islam and his latest, Religions A to Z, a guide to 100 influential religious movements. James, icons, spiritual icons, I guess you've seen them all.
Yeah.
And tell me why they are so precious to people of faith.
I think in the world of faith we need symbols because we all know that God is the unseen, and so symbols on earth are reminders of truths we can't see. Or they also serve a function just like our wedding rings. We look at our wedding rings and realize this isn't just a piece of metal, it represents the holy, the sacred. And it's that way in religion. There's some religions that don't like images or icons, but the vast majority have symbols, and they represent what's holy and true.
John, I want to ask you now, as someone with the artist side of this, the depictor side of this, what kind of sensitivities do people get into when they're trying to depict their holy images?
Well, I think for the creative process, there's a sense in which what comes to the artist carries the artist along. I think there's always a concern that you want to be true to the sensibilities of both the community that you're a member of and true to the image that you're trying to create. And so there's certainly some uneasiness about it, but on the other hand, it comes from a very deep place within the artist. And so the artist wants to express those things that they feel very, very deeply.
Okay. I want to talk about these sensibilities because obviously we've seen that the cartoon depictions of Muhammad have been blasphemous, they have violated all sensibilities, but you don't have to look very far to find flavor of the week. Kanye West pretending he's Jesus Christ. It deeply offends me. James, why don't we see complaints?
Well, I would say Christianity's gone through a period where we used to be, like in the Middle Ages, like the Islamic world. If this happened in the Middle Ages, he would be dead. But we went through an enlightenment where we realized freedom's important, especially after the 30 Years' War. And I think Islam hasn't gone through that enlightenment period in terms of respecting freedom. We need to understand Islam doesn't separate church and state like is done in the West, and they don't value free speech. And that's why there's such conflict today.
So this is just simply images like this are the different kinds of cartoons that can be out there on Christ. They are a progression and not an offense any longer then?
Oh, I would say they offend us. Like a lot of Christians were offended by the TV show Daniel that had Jesus as a regular guest. Christians complained. The good thing is they didn't burn embassies down, and I would urge Muslims to consider how the violence feeds into the stereotype of Islam as a religion that doesn't care about peace.
John, let's talk about an artist's right to freedom of expression.
I would want to say that, along with Jim, that in the Western culture, that freedom trumps religious sensibilities. It's something that we hold so highly that religious sensibilities seem to take second place to our freedoms. And in fact, I think a lot of what's happening here around this Muslim controversy is precisely about that. What they were trying to do is to see how far the press could go in terms of expressing freedom of the press and what would be the response. And now they know something about what the response is. So you have here, I think, what was referred to a number of years ago by the author Samuel Huntington, a clash of civilizations. You've got two cultures, a Western culture and the Islamic culture, that are in conflict here.
If there's any redeeming value that can come out of this, I'm wondering if it could be an understanding of what is the role of the sacred image.
The Danish cartoonists would realize, even though we're free in the West to do this kind of move, I think our world will be a lot better place if we so deeply respect the other person that we won't violate their space. And Hans Kung, the famous German scholar, said there won't be any peace on the planet until there's peace between religions. No, we're not going to agree on everything. We're going to have different views of truth, but we could learn to better get along with one another.
Okay, John, what is the role of the religious icon? What am I, as a person of faith, supposed to experience when I am considering an image of my deity?
Well, image of deity is controversial, I think, even from the outset, and certainly is within Islam, and has been within Judaism, and to some extent has been in Christianity as well. However, within the Christian context, we've been able to have images partly because of our belief in what's known as the incarnation, that God takes on human form. That's allowed for a greater freedom with respect to images. What we hope with sacred images is that they will open us to see more clearly something of the transcendent. They will enrich our experience. Art has a certain kind of ambiguity about it. It's not always easy to pin down. And as we look at art, we're able sometimes to see things that we have not seen before. So it can be a great catalyst to enrich our worship experience, our sense of who God is, our sense of ourselves, and our sense of the world in which we live.
One of the very interesting things has been the different types of thoughts and ideas that have been used to promote people's faith. Images, icons. We're going to go next to Hollywood, where the images that C.S. Lewis created through his fiction depict the holy. How come C.S. Lewis hasn't run into trouble?
I would say because he was so brilliant. I often tell my students, God gave a gift to the academy, to professors like myself, in that an English literature prof has done more to defend Christianity than any scholar or theologian, any theologian or Christian philosopher. He was so great at literature that he took that motif and wrote his novels, his science fiction work. And I think it's because he's subtle, and he knew that the way to penetrate a culture is sometimes better through the subtle means, the diplomatic means, not pounding people over the head.
Thank you both for coming. Well, coming up, Hollywood has perhaps done the most successful interpretation of sacred art and imagery, and we'll find out how those latest Christian symbols do at the Oscars. C.S. Lewis' work, The Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, is set to become one of the most significant stories of Christian imagery. Why has it worked so well for the power of the sacred story? That's next on Listen Up. Oxford scholar C.S. Lewis was a staunch defender of Christianity and told an allegory of Jesus in the Narnia series. Here to help us understand why the spiritual images he created have really raised mostly curiosity, we go to a museum dedicated to C.S. Lewis at Wheaton, Illinois. Dr. Lon Allison, director of the Billy Graham Center there, is a Narnia fan. He gives us a tour.
This is a wardrobe. Not just any wardrobe. This wardrobe was built by the grandfather of C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, the author of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And as a boy, Lewis used to climb into this wardrobe and play in it. In fact, as I move my hands through the coats, yes, there's a back on the wardrobe today, but word has it, it's not always that way. The Wade Center is a place where people come to study Lewis and his writings. We have one of his desks here that Lewis used at Oxford, and then also later in his home, a table where he and his friends like Tolkien probably gathered and talked quite often. In fact, this desk is the desk of J.R.R. Tolkien. At this desk, he penned The Hobbit. At this desk, he penned many of the major portions of the Lord of the Rings. At the Wade Center, we have collections of Lewis, of Tolkien, of Chesterton, of MacDonald, of Dorothy Sayers, many others. It's a treasure trove for people that want to do research on those great authors. And every once in a while, you can find an actual academic walking around. Well, Jerry, I suppose the first question that anyone would have is why would C.S. Lewis, this professor at Oxford and Cambridge, write children's stories?
Well, Lon Lewis never gave up his love for children's stories, but also he realized that the story form served his rhetorical vision. He understood that if we take the word definition It literally means of the finite. We define a thing by its limitation and its function. It has to be small enough for us to wrap words around it in order for us to define it. But how do you define God? How do you define the transcendent? Even the scriptures say the kingdom of heaven is like. It employs simile, metaphor, figures of speech, parables, and story. And Lewis knew story was the best way he could say certain things.
It seems very clear that Lewis is talking about spiritual issues in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So do we call this an allegory?
Lewis would prefer not to call it an allegory because there's no point-for-point relation between the events in the story and events as they occur in our world. He called it a supposal. Suppose there was a world like Narnia, with talking beasts who could reason and feel. And so consequently, he said, if there's a world like this and God came into that world, what would it be like? And he's asking more of a question, what must this be like?
Well then, Jerry, what are some of the key spiritual principles or ideas that Lewis is presenting?
Well, I think Lewis understood that everybody lives beneath the level of his own life conviction, and none of us is very life skilled. We all may believe in the high ideal of love, but we have sharp words with people we say we love most in the world. We believe in justice, but find sometimes we've been unfair. And here's a boy named Edmund who can clearly see all the shortcomings of others, but he thinks he's fine. Eventually, in time, when he realizes he hooked his wagon to the wrong horse and sided with the White Witch, and that he was a betrayer and a traitor, he feels deeply about his error, but realizes he can't fix his problem himself. So consequently, Aslan enters the scene, and appealing to a magic from the dawn of time, he and the White Witch broker an arrangement whereby Aslan will give up his life to set the traitor free from all conditions that bind him because of his error. The White Witch triumphs in destroying Aslan, but after that triumph, she discovers that there's a magic from before the dawn of time as Aslan raises from the dead and manifests that he has the power to both forgive the errors done and love the one who has been the betrayer. And the image is so strong and powerful that somehow it breaks through and communicates to us in ways that maybe propositional language won't. And we feel our way through the story. As a matter of fact, Lewis believed that most people reject spiritual truth, not by virtue of reason, but by virtue of emotion. And he believes that it's as if we had dragons standing sentry over our hearts, and the story can pierce past those watchful dragons and move us most deeply. And in this story, each of us, I think, if we realize our own attempts to fix our lapses, are deeply moved by what has occurred.
Well then, to Lewis, Dr. Root, who is Aslan?
It's interesting that in one of the other books, Lucy is told that she will never be able to come back to Narnia again. Aslan has spoken to this, and Lucy weeps and says, you know, Aslan, it's not Narnia. How shall we go on living, knowing we'll never meet you again? And he says, oh, but child, I live in your world too, only there I go by a different name. And you have been brought here for a time, that knowing me here for a while, you might know me better in your world. There was a child who, reading that in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, wrote to Lewis and says, who is Aslan in our world? And Lewis responded and said, you guess. He created all of Narnia. He is the son from the emperor over the sea. He arrives at the same time Father Christmas has come, and he's able to set right every wrong. You guess who Aslan might be in our world.
The spiritual ideas that C.S. Lewis presents in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe were things he believed in very strongly, but it hadn't always been that way. Lewis was an atheist. He came to slowly believe in God, and then after that began to consider Jesus Christ. But the way it happened was through his good friend J.R.R. Tolkien, Lord of the Rings. They were on an evening walk along the river in Oxford, And Tolkien said something like, Lewis, you love the stories and the myths about God stepping into the human world and helping them. But why is it you won't consider that the Christian story may be a true story that really happened? That was part of the process of C.S. Lewis considering Christian spirituality. And the world is thankful that he did.
Closed captioning provided by Duca Financial Services Credit Union. Discover more affordable banking at duca.com.
Well, they could call this a bestseller, but it's free. It's Our Daily Bread, one of North America's most popular spiritual resources for the questions that affect your lives. Available for you at keypromises.org, no cost or obligation. Order your copy today. The remarkable thing about the interpretation of story and images, when it's all pointing to the divine love of God, is that God would love to see our imagination inspired, to find the biggest exploration of His love for our lives in a personal way. If all this talk about images of the sacred only leaves us with despair and anger, we've missed the greatest discovery of the love of God to be found by the human race. For Listen Up TV, I'm Lorna Dueck.